Hooah! Dear pirates, philosophers, thinkers, heretics, and humanists. Welcome aboard the ship of the Stoic Pirate and on our quest for the treasure of the good life. My name is Matt and I'm the host of the podcast, The Stoic Pirate. In this 71st episode, we will talk about mass shootings, about spree killers, about gun control, the somewhat strange American political system, about the mental state of heads of state, and how madness has shaped history. I'm very excited to have as a guest Professor J Ferguson, a specialist in mass shootings, serial killers, and mad heads of state. Professor Ferguson holds a chair at Stetson University in Orlando, Florida. He has also recently written a successful and exciting book titled How Madness Shaped History. Really worth reading and very entertaining. He has also done a lot of research related to violence and computer games. So before we get started, a note on my own behalf. If you want to read the transcript of this show, go to my website at www.muellermatthias.ch. That is www.muellermatthias.ch. That's where you find the transcript of this show. You will also find the translation, the German translation of this interview that I had with Professor Dr. Christopher J Ferguson. Okay, that's it. Let's get started. So, I'm really excited to have Professor Christopher J Ferguson here on the ship of the Stoic Pirate. It's my second show that I do in English, and I'm really excited to have you here, Christopher. And we're going to talk a little bit about mass shootings. We're going to talk about mental health of head of states, and also how madness shaped history. But before we start, why don't you give some background information about you, about who is Chris J Ferguson, so my listeners and viewers, they know a little bit about your expertise.
International man of mystery. Yeah, it is. No, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I got a PhD in clinical psychology, licensed as a psychologist, and I'm now a psychology professor at Stetson University, which is just outside of Orlando, which is an amazing place to live. Beautiful weather, beautiful city, lots of fun things to do. And mostly spent my time, I mean, I guess I'm sort of a forensic psychologist, so I really got into psychology to study things like mass homicides and serial killers, kind of like a lot of students do. I'd seen Silence of the Lambs, and I think that, was interesting. So, it was kind of a goofy reason to get into a field, but nonetheless, that's what did it. And then I ended up, because of that, because of all the talk about violent video games and mass homicides, I ended up getting involved in a lot of video game research, actually, which ended up being super lucrative, I guess, not in a financial sense, because nobody makes money off of academic publishing, but yeah, at least in terms of getting a lot of good science out there. And it turns out it's much easier to do video game research than mass homicide research, so it ended up being a good diversion. But I'm so interested in the issue of mass homicides and other violent crime. So yeah, that's kind of it. I don't know what else you want to know. I'm married, have a 18-year-old son, so it's all good.
Cool. So you were saying you talked about you were kind of specialized in mass homicide, also computer games. I will ask you some questions about that, because there's also some, say, stereotypes or maybe connections between. But first, last weekend, there was another mass shooting that happened in a mall in Buffalo. I think there were 10 people killed, 3 left injured. And of course, such incidents, they also make headlines right away in Europe, like breaking news, also this weekend. And if you talk with people here in Europe and you ask, they always think oh my God, this incidents, they're on the rise in the US. There's happening more.
Yeah.
Is this impression right? Is that true, or are mass shootings on the rise in the US in the last years?
Yeah, I mean, so the good news is that they are rare events, so it's not like, um, you know, we don't really live in fear of, walking down the street and, going to the mall and being in a mass homicide. We are a fairly big country. We're 330 million people, so we're the third largest country. So things are going to happen more frequently in the U.S. than they do other places. The other thing is, of course, we do have a lot of firearms, compared to other countries. Although I understand Switzerland has a fairly high
Right.
firearm rate as well. So there's that little element that's thrown into it. So if you kind of look at general crimes in the United States, we actually don't have a very high violent crime rate compared to Europe. So if you look at where the United States fits compared to other European or Commonwealth countries like Australia and New Zealand, that the United States is about middle of the pack. So we actually have fewer assaults per capita than do like the United Kingdom or New Zealand or Australia or France or Belgium. I don't know what's going on in Belgium, but they're neither. I don't know. They're all neurotic because they're neither Dutch nor French. I don't know. They don't know what they are. So we're actually less likely to get assaulted in the United States than if we go to like Paris, for instance. Where we're high is in homicides, right? And it's not too hard to figure out why. It's because even though our assault rate is not necessarily that high, it's easy to turn an assault into a homicide with a firearm, as opposed to, strangling someone to death or beating someone or knifing someone. That takes a lot more work, right?
Yep.
And persistence. So that's why we have such a high homicide rate. I think a lot of people sort of assume that like violent crime across the board is very high in the United States. And that actually is not the case. Like I said, you're more likely to get beaten up in London than you are in typical Orlando, for instance. But if these events are scary, nonetheless, there's no question why, so what happens is, there's a psychological phenomenon called the availability heuristic, which means that if you can remember events, you tend to think they occur more frequently than they do. And obviously, mass homicides are very memorable, newsworthy. They get a lot of news coverage. They do happen in other countries. I think even Switzerland had one. A few years ago. Yeah. But of course, in other countries, you see people driving over each other with trucks or blowing up bombs or other things too, even if firearms are. There was a guy running around, I think, with a sword in London not a few years ago that managed to, I think, kill a few people. But and then even like China and Japan, Asian countries have these from time to time as well. Usually knives or swords or things like that. Now, what people point out is obviously you can kill more people with a gun than you can a sword, and that's absolutely true. So that's why I think we have a bit more of a problem in the United States. It's not so much that we have more people that want to do these things. It's just that when someone wants to do something like that, they can get a semi-automatic rifle, which makes it easier, as opposed to Spain, France, UK. You have to try to drive your truck over a bunch of people, which may or may not work out, as well. I mean, again, when I say this, I'm not encouraging it, obviously, so I think that's kind of what's happening. But the rate hasn't gone up. It's just that, in a big country, these are going to occur, unfortunately, every couple of months, and that's just going to keep it in people's imagination over and over and over again. We probably have more than other countries like Europe, in particular. But again, that's likely just due to our firearm rate, more than anything else. And our firearm ownership is much less controlled than, say, in Switzerland. I think where there's a bit more oversight, to it. So that's what's going on here. But no, you don't have to. If you come to the United States, you're not going to get shot, or at the very least, the odds of it are like God doesn't love you. If it happens to you, no, I'm obviously joking. I have a morbid sense of humor, so. But no, the odds are, it's like a lightning strike. Could it happen? Sure, but it's not going to happen.
Okay. Yeah. So you're basically saying they're not on the rise, such stuff that happens, and it's not that the U.S. are more violent than other countries, but there's more firearms, and maybe for that people use more firearms, which are more effective when you do a crime. So. I saw there was a psychologist called Gillian Peterson and the sociologist James Stansley. They published a book, 2021. They called or titled that book "The Violence Project: How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic." So,
Mm.
if I understood you right, you wouldn't call it an epidemic,
No,
or
I don't. I'm usually hesitant to use the word epidemic for a lot of things, other than like COVID-19. So the term it sells books. I mean, I get it. They probably sell a lot more books than I do, because it gets people scared. So fear sells, and but yeah, no, there's no sense of it being an epidemic in any way that I would understand it, in terms of it either being a common phenomenon or it being an increasing phenomenon. The best data we have right now is that the level is staying the same, and that it is still very rare.
yeah,
Like I said, the average person, I've never been anywhere near a mass homicide in my life,
yeah,
and I'm above 50 at this point, so never been touched, never known anybody who's been in one, never known anyone that's known anyone who's been, just no contact whatsoever
yeah,
with any. So, and that's not to minimize the ones that occur. I don't want to downplay it. On the other hand, say, well, it's not, it's not a big deal at all. I think in a broad sense, I probably would agree with those authors that obviously any number is too many,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
we do have them occur in the United States, and we would like there to be zero. So, I can say as often as I like that, the odds of you ever being in one is, fantastically small, even in the United States. But for the people who have been one, obviously for them, this is a very personal, very traumatic experience. They've lost loved ones or things like that. So I'm not trying to downplay it or downplay the seriousness of the people that have experienced it. So I think, in general, I would probably be very interested to hear what they have to say, about their prescriptions for reducing the frequency of these events. I mean, I have my own basic ideas,
Yeah,
but which I'm guessing are going to be probably pretty similar to theirs. But I just hesitate to use the word epidemic, because we see people use that for like everything.
everything. Yeah,
Anything you want to draw people's attention to, people will use the word epidemic, and I really think that word should be reserved for COVID-19,
yeah,
or things like that
yeah,
are actual diseases that are spreading rapidly through a
yeah.
population. So.
And you said it, like fear sells, and I think
Mhm.
that's also a little bit what happens in the media. So like, I mean, an accident with 10 people, where 10 people die, they
Yeah.
probably don't bring it. If there's a bus accident somewhere in the U.S. with 10 or 8 people dying, they don't bring it. But a mass shooting has something; it touches us. Like it's something scary. It's more, and it's funny because I read in a comment, and you mentioned it all kind of like basically already before that there is not really a risk that if you go to a mall that you're shot, because I read on a reader comment on a new online portal of a major German newspaper. I think it was Die Welt or Frankfurter Allgemeine. Someone wrote in the comment, I quote, "In the US, you have to expect to be shot at any time in a mall, a school, or a church. Even though
Yeah.
the US is a great vacation destination, I don't go there anymore." So, what would would you try to calm this person down?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot like this actually, and I'm sure it hurts the tourism industry.
Yeah, well, people do still come, so it's
Yeah,
that's bad. Yeah, I think COVID-19 was the real bad thing for the
yeah,
tourist. Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, I get it. I mean, what happens, of course, is you just see these stories in the news media, and Americans freak out too.
yeah,
So people have the perception that they're occurring more often than they actually are. And again, the most comforting number would be zero. And unfortunately, we don't have zero of these things. But I'll tell you, because I'm leading a study abroad to London this year, and a few years ago, the last time I led one, I got a lot of Americans who were afraid to go to London because of the truck, and I think someone had
yes,
run over someone with a truck, and there are the people with like the
the
knives and the
knives.
swords running
Yeah,
around, and so it happens in both directions. You get Americans who don't want to go to Europe, because they're afraid of riots in Paris, and
yeah,
and bombs in London and all kinds of So it's people see the stuff in the news,
yeah,
and we tend to overestimate the frequency.
yeah.
Fortunately, I don't think Switzerland has picked up on any of
No,
the.
it's like
So
that's
I
what I
think
just wanted to say. It's like people can come to
everybody running
Switzerland.
around windmills, eating cheese, and chocolate,
Yeah,
So
exactly. So people can come to Switzerland. There's almost no crime. Everything is very
picture there being
expensive.
like no actual cities. It's just like fields of dandelions, mountains,
No, no,
crossing really
It's
is.
that's the
Like a couple
stereotype.
people in like these like orange and yellow like waistcoats with pikes ready to like
Yeah,
hold the Germans away or something. I don't know.
exactly.
So, so I don't think Switzerland's like it got too much of that reputation.
No,
but in fairness, probably to be honest with you, probably most Americans couldn't find Switzerland
no,
on
on
a
the
map.
map.
We just don't hear much about Switzerland.
No.
But yeah, so I mean, but that's just and the other thing too is I think we have so many movies, right? See, like
Right.
Die Hard, right? You see these American movies where like everybody, like everything's blowing up and they're like cars, so you picture that's like the norm in like an American city. And like I said, you're more likely to get your ass kicked in Paris than you
Yeah.
are in New York. So I don't know that I would put it to the test experimentally, but being in Paris, and I'm the dummy who walks everywhere. So sometimes you walk through a section and you go, oh my god, like And I remember walking up through like the north parts of Paris, like outside the main touristy areas, and going, wow, this looks. I went the wrong way. The obvious, like obviously mentally ill people, in the street screaming at each other and stuff like that. So you can see bad places, anyway. Again, the difference is, there's not a wide availability of firearms in Paris. So, we do have, like I said, our homicide rate is higher, but again, that's mainly localized to those types of neighborhood, so the reality is, like I said, I live in Orlando. There are bad sections of Orlando where homicides do occur. They just don't occur where I live for the most part, so that's like a typical city is you can, as long as you stay to the touristy area for the most part, you'll be pretty safe.
You'll be fine.
And just ask around like where are the bad places I shouldn't drive to, and that's fine. Like I've been I'm going to New York next week. In fact, I'm not scared at all to go to New York, but there are definitely parts of New York City that are dangerous.
That you better not go.
Don't go there.
I was actually
I shouldn't have walked where I walked in Paris either.
No, I was a couple of years ago, I was in Philadelphia, and I wanted to go make a picture of Rocky Balboa's house.
Okay,
well, I went there, and I have to say the neighborhood is really bad. I didn't read about it before, and then I saw after a New York Times article who said like it's like the Walmart of heroin. So I'm like, and I'm like, yeah, it was it was a little bit, because I think they all thought I was a cop or something.
Okay, gotcha.
They were really, and then I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm not staying too long, but no, but I think so too. I mean, there's crazy people everywhere, and yeah, but another prejudice that is really strong in Europe is that all these mass shootings are committed by right-wing extremists, by KKK or at least MAGA hat wearing right-wingers, racists. On the other hand, I was reading on the internet that a Republican congresswoman from New York, Claudia Tenney, she claimed that the majority of mass shooters are actually close to Democrats, that they were Democrats or left-wingers, Bernie Sanders fans or whatever. Is it even...
Blame it all on Bernie.
Well, I think because there was one, I think on a baseball field, like an older guy, 67 years old, and it seems he was a Bernie Sanders fan. So, but is there even a connection between political views and mass shootings? Can you make a profile, even like political profile of mass shooters, or...
Not really, no. I mean, what you get is, of course, with these events, when a mass homicide happens, like everybody comes out of the woodwork and tries to like steal that event to further their own political cause is really what happens, whether it's on the right or the left. The typical mass homicide perpetrator is male, about 35 to 40, non-political for the most part, full of rage, they're full of anger and rage, they're antisocial. Typically chronically mentally ill in most situations, and just full of resentment. That's it. That's the profile. You get a few females as well, so I did say most are male, but no, most mass homicide perpetrators are not aligned to any particular politics. So you get like the guy from 2018 or 2017 who like broke a window in his hotel and started firing down on a country music festival.
Yes.
And he has in the United States, he has the record, I think, at this point for number. There's like 60 some people got killed. Norway has the world record as far as I remember. Yeah, Anders Breivik. but nobody ever knew why. He never left any notes. You know,
Yeah.
he never said why he did it. You know, he died, of course, he committed suicide. So nobody knows what his motive was at all, you know, but he never had any particular politics. He just hated people for whatever reason, you know. So that's a more typical or like the Sandy Hook shooter who went into an elementary school and just started, you know, blowing kids and teachers away, you know, in 2012. Same thing, you know, no politics, you know, just hated people for one reason or another. You occasionally will see, because they are hate-filled individuals, they may gravitate towards more extreme viewpoints, which is not, I don't think that's a stunner, you know, so some will. So like the I shouldn't say gentleman, but the individual this week in Buffalo, you know, the data on him is pretty early, but it looks like he went back and forth between communism and this kind of racist fascism, which is where he kind of landed eventually. But even in his writings, apparently he does describe going back and forth between the extreme left and extreme right. He was, you know, obviously he endorsed these racist beliefs, you know, about whatever, the great replacement or whatever they're calling it. But yeah, I mean, you get far left. There was also just a few months ago, fortunately nobody died, but there was an individual who was a Black American who opened fire on a subway
in New York.
I think that was in New York City. And he also was racially motivated. So he was angry at white people, you know, so it does happen in both directions there, you know, as well. Unfortunately, sometimes our news media, believe it, I don't know about Swiss news media, but our news media aren't always the most honest, you know, so.
That's a worldwide thing.
Yeah, so like white nationalism is like a big, like there's like a big narrative around that in the United States right now. So the news media will tend to highlight a case like the Buffalo shooter, as they should. I mean, I'm not saying they should, as they should, and they'll sort of talk about his racism. But with the New York City Black shooter, they kind of de-emphasized his racist beliefs in that situation because it didn't fit the narrative, if you will. You know, so that's kind of a problem, I think, too, that at least people have, you know, so certainly like, you know, white nationalism, far right, you know, terrorism, domestic terrorism is a problem. But again, it's like super rare. Like most crimes in the United States are not motivated by anything like that. And I think that people will use those terms. The government will use those terms because, of course, it allows them, again, to fear, and then they get more influence and power and authority, right? You know, so you have to be a little bit careful. Again, not saying that there's not a problem at all, but on the other hand, the idea there's like a Nazi behind every bush, you know, is obviously false. You know, this is a fringe movement you know, if you look at like, you know, Le Pen getting 40% in like French, I don't think that anything like that would happen. Well, let me walk that back and point out like Trump might run in 2024, so I might eat my words. In 2024, you know. So, but I think, you know, the reasons behind that is Trump's ascension, and maybe Marie Le Pen's as well. In fairness, it has less to do with real endorsement of what you might think of the true like far right Nazism, fascism, authoritarianism, and more frustration, you know, with general sort of elite, you know, the inequities, you know, in terms of, you know, financial inequities, legal inequities, everything else, where the elite are kind of like grabbing power. So I think that's really, it's a populist movement that isn't really that thrilled with, you know, it's not really Nazis, you know, that kind of thing.
That's what I think too.
I think maybe Le Pen, that's why I kind of picked on her, was maybe has a bit more of a history of being a little closer to, you know,
especially her father and her father also. That's they have a whole family history about that.
Right. Yeah. Trump's more of just a narcissist, you know. I don't think he has any ideological, you know, he wants power for himself, but, you know, he would be a Democrat or Republican, whatever.
As long as it gives power.
He doesn't care, you know, he's just himself.
He also changed party. I think he was once more Democrat. I think he was once a Democrat.
Every party.
Yeah. So
he was a Democrat for a while, and then he was part of the the Reform Party, I think, which is the nothing party in the United States. But it was Ross Perot's party.
Oh yes.
I believe he was a member of that. Maybe I might be mistaken, but my memory is that he was a member. Then, and of course, he became a Republican and completely changed the Republican Party. Into it's just the Trump party at this point, and it like literally has no platform. Its only platform is to get Trump elected, you know. But it's theoretically conservative, but all this stuff doesn't, you know. American politics are completely scrambled at this point, unfortunately. But but yeah, so I mean, we do get, on the other hand, there have been some shooters who have aligned themselves, or perpetrators who align themselves to far left, perspectives as well.
That's,
So, but they're the minority. Kind of going back to the
okay.
question, it really is that the majority of perpetrators of mass homicides are not particularly ideological. But what will happen is when a case pops up, if it fits someone's narrative, they'll tend to glom onto it. So this one's about, because we're having this big debate about like race, so sort of
Yes.
tap into that one. Whereas the African American perpetrator didn't help that narrative, so everybody kind of ignored race in that situation. There was another African American fellow who drove a truck through a crowd of mostly older white women. So again, everybody was talking about a truck hit a bunch of people. Well, the
Yeah.
truck didn't do it.
It
It was
was
a
somebody
person
who's driving. Yeah.
truck, who was sort of behind this. So it is kind of funny to see how like news media now try to
Yeah.
like stick to the narrative, and inconvenient details get left out. But if a perpetrator targets women, then people start talking about like misogyny and this kind of
Yes.
stuff. So it literally is like people will try to like advance their own political goals, which may
Agenda.
be very worthwhile. I'm not trying to pick on those goals. But what they do is they focus in on these idiosyncratic elements of these homicides, just like they used to do with video games,
Yeah.
rather than looking for the commonalities between them. That these are usually, highly distressed, highly antisocial, highly ruminating individuals, and that's really the commonality. If you look at the basic personality
Yeah.
or mental profile of these individuals, it's pretty consistent across, whether it's left, right, non-ideological, whether they are targeting women or targeting men or targeting kids. They all basically look like hateful, angry people. And we probably should look at those commonalities as solutions, because if, for instance, if you could wave a magic wand and make the great replacement theory, whatever the hell that thing is, go away, this guy would still have killed people. So it has nothing to do with, this idea. I mean, you absolutely can critique this great replacement theory, and I'm happy to do so. But taking that away would not have stopped this person from killing a bunch of people, because he just wanted to kill a bunch of people because he was angry, and he came up with an excuse for it.
And
But
but why, and what is it? What is it that makes people want to kill other people? Like, why are they so hateful, or why they're loners? Or are there any red flags we could see in individuals where we could do something about it? Or
yeah, in some cases, yes, but it's tricky. I mean, obviously predicting violence in the future is very difficult to do. So these are individuals that tend to have a long history of either suicidal depression or psychosis, and they tend to be angry and antisocial. So what happens is they typically are struggling to function for the most part in society. And tend to resent others. So we've all had moments of sometimes resenting someone somewhere. Oh, I didn't get promoted because this other person screwed me over for my job. But we let it go because hopefully we're otherwise well-adjusted people. Injustices happen to all of us. We get resentful, but we move on. These people tend to collect that. So it just gets stuck in their head, the unfairness of it all. And they either blame a group of people, which the group of people they tend to blame the most tend to be human resources departments, because a lot of these take place in workplaces, right? So if they get fired or their pay is being docked for one reason or another, they may tend to target their bosses and that kind of stuff. But otherwise, they may view society as having screwed them over. They didn't achieve what they were supposed to. In some cases it may be, they're lonely, so it's women's fault, because women won't date them, or they may, end up believing something about, the Jews or Black people or white people, or cops. There was one shooting in Dallas where, again, another African-American fellow targeted police officers and stuff like that, so people, they may get resentful towards specific groups of people. I'm trying to think in the European cases, there have been some cases of Islam motivated attacks. There was the Paris attacks where two people targeted was the Charlie Hebdo magazine, and then went on a rampage to Paris. So there could be a lot of different reasons why people are angry, but below it, the sort of core personality style of these people is pretty similar. So if we really want to kind of like figure out how to stop these things, first off, we need to stop giving them the attention that they want, So there really is this idea of like, first off, not using their names, so they don't become famous as individuals. But that's hard to stop, news media still do it, unfortunately. But also we really need to stop this kind of introspection. What did we do wrong as a society? It's kind of the common response, whether it's video games or, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or, I don't know, whatever else people might be upset with, racial discord or something like that. We really need to stop blaming ourselves, because again, we're just giving these people what they want. They want to cause discord in society and make everybody angry. And this guy in Buffalo, I bet he's tickled to death if he's looking at people on Fox News and CNN arguing over whether the Republicans are stop it. We just need to stop doing that, for one thing, to because that's just feeding right into what they want, But other than that, I mean, I think it's part in the United States we do have the challenge of like firearms are everywhere, so that's going to add to the mix here. And unfortunately, our screening for access to them is not very robust. We have there are reasons for that, and I understand those reasons. I sort of would be open to the idea of some form of psychological evaluation or something like that. But I understand the Second Amendment. People right now point to the Ukraine and say like, look, part of the reason like Ukraine's doing so well is because everybody had an AK-47. And people were shooting at Russians from their windows and stuff like that. Like, okay, fair enough. I mean, that's a fair argument, in that. I mean, I don't think we're gonna get invaded by the Russians anytime soon, but nonetheless, I get that argument. That there is that other side of it that, that's kind of an extreme event, but it obviously it did happen to the Ukraine, so fair enough. So I get the arguments from the other side too, and also Americans are really suspicious of our governments. We don't like authority, for the most part. So there's that cultural element of it. So we're always worried about. I know to European mind, it's like obviously you guys should have better gun control, and I actually tend to agree.
The thing is, like, it's really interesting because, like, in Switzerland, we're a little bit the island out of it, like of all the other countries. We have like. We're also a part of the European Union, and we have a lot of firearms, and it's also a cultural thing. First, we have also a very, I would say, like from the whole history, we're very critical about authorities.
Yeah,
we don't even have a president. Like we have seven guys who have to share it together. Like we don't want that one guy has power.
Yeah, and that's probably a good idea.
It's actually, I think it's a brilliant idea because it's not good to. I think so too. I don't think it's good to have too much power for one person. Yeah. And what I think is, because I don't believe in gun control and all that stuff, and I don't like when they all talk about like, oh, we have to ban guns and everything, because I also quite believe in the Second Amendment things, and I think the people should have the right to defend themselves. But what I think is the big difference in Switzerland and the US is, in Switzerland, every able man, we still have a conscript system in the armed forces. So every guy, well, almost every guy, does military service when he's like between 19 and 24, where he gets for 18 weeks in basic training, he can shoot. And it's like, it's almost out of the system after. First, everybody they did it, they could shoot around with their automatic rifles, and on plus, they were trained and they know the security measures, they know what can happen. And after, it's almost like guys are like, oh, I don't, because they normally should go every year for a practice. And often they're like, oh, I don't want to go. They had it out of their system. And I think, I think it's a little bit like, almost all the guys like to shoot at a certain age. But if you don't trained, and I think that's a little bit the problem in the US. Of course, if you're going in the army, you can only go on, I mean, you're psychologically screened. So normally we don't have the mental ill people, so and if you don't do the military, you also don't get a license to get a gun after.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
and that's really our issue. I think you hit on the head. Is it's not, the problem really isn't so much that we have a lot of firearms. It's that the easy access to them is allowing some of these people that have mental health problems or other background problems to get them. So we don't have that kind of system like it sounds like Switzerland has about training and screening for widespread otherwise widespread access. But I think that kind of brings me to like the other issue, which I don't think is unique to the United States, is we don't really have much of a comprehensive mental health system that's state sponsored, right? So like a lot of countries, we got rid of our asylum system in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of that was good because the asylums were abusive and the due process was not there, but that ended up releasing a bunch of people into the public who maybe should kind of be in an asylum. But a better asylum than was available in the 1960s, but maybe still kind of need the long-term inpatient care, so I'm really an advocate for this idea of sort of bringing back and some kind of asylum system. Now it should be state sponsored, which is going to be a hard lift because of taxes, right? But also it should be humane, based on the best treatments available. And then also have due process. So maybe every 3-6 months, whatever, there's a review of the case to make sure that the person's not just stuck in there forever, even though they don't have any symptoms. So I think a few of those things might help, because right now you get in some of these situations, and again, the details on the Buffalo shooter are still kind of new at this point, but I know certainly in some other cases, you do get these cases of like the person had no real obvious problems in their background, and would have probably made it through, at least a perfunctory check. They had no red flags, if you will. But there are some, like, in the Parkland shooting in 2018 and here in Florida, a young male again attacked a school. And he had a long history of psychological problems, which is not uncommon at all for a lot of these mass homicide perpetrators. So they do have these long histories, and the thing is if you have someone that you identify as like, okay, this person's on Mars, basically, they cannot function, independently in society and probably never will. We don't really have that option at this point of like a state sponsor. I mean, we have a few, but the bar to get into them is pretty high. But so it seems like we could possibly do better at finding some of these individuals who, in most cases, are not necessarily going to be violent. So we're talking about people with like chronic schizophrenia who are going to be homeless, even, right? So they may not really be a danger to society, but they're just living on the streets right now. If you kind of had a system that could identify these individuals with chronic mental health issues or with chronic antisocial issues, that you could put them into appropriate long-term care. First off, they would be getting better care. And then also, even though most of them are not going to become violent criminals, some of them will. And you will reduce at least some of the violence, that's caused by some of these individuals, So it certainly is a cast the net wide sort of thing, in the sense of you can't say, well, this person is going to be the one, who's going to be a mass homicide perpetrator. But they're going to be in that mix of individuals. And as long as all those individuals, need care, and you have a due process system that makes sure that you're not doing like Minority Report sort of stuff, where you're just thinking like, I don't know, he looks kind of suspicious to me. So it should definitely be a big focus on due process, I think if we design somewhat of a better long-term care system, that might resolve not all of these cases, but it might resolve some of these cases at least that wouldn't come to pass because they would be in care.
So I think basically what you're saying is like you should have a better state care system, like that takes care of such individuals. Right now, I have the feeling, and I mean, it's everywhere a little bit so, but in the US, it's quite extreme. Like, I have the feeling that, I mean, politicians, they always have one solution. It's like making a new law, banning something, and then putting people in prison, punish them. And especially in the US, you put them all in prison, I have the feeling.
We did.
It's like, and I don't think there's a lot of people, I don't think they belong in prison. They should be in care or something. And
we have, and actually getting this debate with a colleague of mine who's in the Netherlands just recently in terms of like, measuring freedom, if you will. And so, because there are always these lists that come out like the top 30 most free countries, whatever. if you look at the reliability lists are terrible, because you look at like, yeah, I'll glance at them and like look at where the United States falls, and sometimes we'll be at the top, and then at other points you get some that will be like we'll be at the bottom, and usually it's like a gotcha headline, like ha ha ha, look at the United States, it's not so free. So the reality is and having experienced Europe, I've never been to Switzerland, so I can't talk about Switzerland, but certainly like the UK, France, and Germany, and other countries around like that. My impression, this is certainly just my own personal impression, is that on most things, the United States feels freer than, so particularly on like First Amendment, like free speech types of issues. I don't think you really just can't beat the United States on free speech, but even on other, like, we're so suspicious of government intrusion in our lives that, generally speaking, we're as libertarian a country as you possibly can find. We are pretty free to do stuff that, like in the UK, here you go on Twitter and say, Matthias is an asshole, right? He's a Nazi, whatever. And you can say that. I mean, you should be this rude. But nothing bad. And they'll arrest you in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Apparently in Germany, if you insult someone in public, you get sued. I would never. I said, oh my God, we're not free. You're doing that, and you're saying we're the unfree ones. That's crazy to an American. That just sounds absurd. But what happens in the United States now, in fairness, so I would say the bar to get into trouble with the criminal justice system is higher than I think even in Europe. So it's unlikely that most Americans will make contact with the criminal, or it would take you more stuff to get into contact with, the criminal justice system than would happen in the UK or France or other places. But once you do, then all of our laws are like, the hammer comes down, So that's why I see, I think you see that, we have a very high incarcerated population. A lot of that is due to drugs. If you are caught with a sellable amount of marijuana, for instance, we're kind of moving in the direction of legalizing marijuana, to be a bad example, but let's say you're caught with a small but arguably shareable amount of cocaine, shareable for a price. It might not be like kilos and kilos, but it might be enough that you're in that level of maybe you're dealing with a couple friends or something like that, right? I imagine in a European country, you get in some trouble, but there also may be some diversion. If you're also a user, they'll try to, get you out of the system and into back into normal life pretty quickly. Whereas here we have all these like 3 strikes, you're out, so you can get like multiple decade sentences for, carrying cocaine or something like that. So that's why we have that problem. It's like, you need to do something kind of stupid, like carry a bunch of cocaine around with you. Of course. It's not like people are coming into our houses and, but once you pass that line, then yes, our sentences are really harsh, really tough, and I think that's where we in the United States, need to relook at that, because I think there are real problems around some of the draconian nature, and we do have this sense of like everything needs to be fixed with a new law, right? So like after the Parkland shooting in Florida in 2018, every legislature wants to introduce new laws that criminalize something new. So if you make threats online, right, now that's like a felony, so now it's the same thing, right? You need to be sort of, you need to make the bad decision, right, of making those threats. And it has to be a fairly credible, so it's not just like, I hate you, whatever, but it has to be like, I'm going to come to your house and kill you, whatever, which you shouldn't do, right? But on the other hand, it's just a threat. Maybe that's a problem, right? But is it the best solution to that problem to charge this person with a felony, or to divert them into some mental health care that may resolve whatever they're experiencing, and they can go back into normal life without a criminal history? So unfortunately, we tend to take a real problem. I'm not saying we should do nothing with people who make threats online. We take a real problem, and our answer is always to make a new law. And criminal, exactly. As opposed to diverting into into mental health
And
care.
that's what I think. We just make everybody makes new laws for everything, and
Yeah.
it's like, and then everybody is breaking the law because there's so many laws you don't even know what to do anymore. Like, but also I mean, but if you talk about laws and everything, and there's also there was also the idea of like banning video games, like
Mhm.
ego shooter games, and
Yeah.
they're also, everybody is like, oh, they're all the specialists out there. Like even Donald Trump said like, oh, it's the computer games who are responsible for mass shootings. So they really have a bad reputation.
Yeah.
It's funny because I was like in 2006 or 2005 6, I was for the Swiss Army. I spent a year in the US, in the US
Mhm.
Armed Forces, Fort
Nice.
Benning in Georgia,
Yeah.
and we trained there on a computer game. We had like this. Everybody had his
Yeah.
laptop. We had a commercial computer game, ego
Yeah.
shooter game, but it was brilliant because we were all really like going into a town, making like, yeah, did all the stuff like the whole platoon. It was really
Yeah.
good for training. And when I came back, they asked me all about like, well, what kind of lessons learned, what could be, and I'm like, well,
Yeah.
that's one thing we should do. It's really cheap. We can buy it. It's a commercial game, and
Yeah.
then the chief of the armed forces, he invited me to come tell me him what I thought, like what we should do, and he was
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God, no, this is
Yeah.
impossible. I'm not. We don't want to train people to become like mass shooters."
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's really a bad reputation about ego shooting games, and I understood you were like kind of like a specialist on that too, like computer games. So is there any connection, or is that an urban legend that it's
Oh,
like?
that's an urban legend. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So the U.S. military doesn't want to train anybody to be mass homicide perpetrators either. It looks bad, right? You know, if
Yes.
you have American soldiers, running down the street mowing everybody down, obviously our foreign policy in the Bush years was pretty aggressive, but generally speaking, the American soldiers are pretty well trained,
Yeah.
and they're trained not to open fire on everything that moves, right? And generally speaking, if you like compare the performance of like American soldiers, even in these kind of crappy wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm not in any way supporting,
Yeah.
especially the Iraq war. That was stupid,
Yeah.
but but in terms of like the professionalism of American soldiers, they really, for the most part, there were certainly a few examples, but like Abu Ghraib, of course, that were horrible. But for the most part, the professionalism of American soldiers was very high. Most of the civilian deaths in Iraq were because of the conflicts between the Shiites and
Hmm.
the Sunni, the people there. But look at that compared to Ukraine, right, where the Russian village is killing everybody. It's pretty different. And again, my point is not to like rah United States would do everything right, because obviously we shouldn't have been in the Iraq war in the first place. But
But the soldiers,
the
they're
soldiers
good.
are not
Yeah.
mowing everybody
No.
down. They're
No.
not.
No.
Our troops very much try to avoid civilian casualties. Of course, sometimes it does happen by accident, but yeah, no, there's no evidence to suggest these kinds of games train people to become more hostile towards other human beings. People understand their games, that they're shooting at pixelated, characters. So it's kind of like a game of tag, and just that you're doing it with the sort of, or maybe like water guns. We don't worry about kids running around with water guns in summer shooting each other, because we know that they know it's all play and good fun. And that basically still applies to video games, as well. We just can't find evidence that, playing these games causes youth violence or mass homicides or bullying or anything else that matters, really, for the most part. And I'm guessing, the reason the military uses these things is for like team training. And I guess that's probably what you would do. So it has nothing to do with trying to make the soldiers kill more things. But rather, and of course, in a lot of games, and I don't know about the game that you use, but a lot of games, if you shoot a civilian, the game ends and you have to restart from where you left off, right? So most of the games, there are exceptions like Grand Theft Auto, but most of these games like Call of Duty don't want you shooting civilians. In fact, I just played the recent World War II Vanguard Call of Duty game, and at one point in the game, I think I was to be fair to myself, I think I was a little confused about who these characters were. So I was like, well, maybe they're bad guys. I'll shoot one and see. And then immediately, the game said shooting civilians is not allowed, and
Yeah.
started me back. So it's like I died, kind
Yeah.
of a thing, So like, oh, okay, the civilians, I won't shoot them. I think it was a bunch of Germans that were hiding in like the subways as Berlin was
Okay.
being by the Russians or whatever. But anyway, so the games are actually, most of the games are actually pretty good about not letting you
Yeah.
open fire on civilians anyway. Yeah, no, there's nothing to worry about with the
Okay.
games.
So if I have some listeners and viewers who are like parents and their kids play like single shooter games or something, they don't have to worry. They don't have to ban or forbid that or something. They can let the kids do, because there's no evidence that there's any.
Yeah, it's fine. You're not going to be able to stop them anyway. They're just going to go to their friend's house and play there.
Absolutely.
So it's good news. Just take the win on this one. This is good news. Is that this is something that you can basically relax about. There's so many other bad things your kid is going to be exposed to, mostly other kids, that worry about that way more than I mean, really, the main problem that kids have, and some kids have, right, is their own parents. It's when the parents are antisocial or abusive or neglectful. That's really the problem that kids have more than anything else, really, other than sometimes other kids, if they're being bullied by other kids or something like that. That's bad too, of course. But those are really the two things I think maybe parents need to watch for. Is first off, don't be a jerk parent. Make sure that your kid knows that you love them. Really, whether you're more authoritarian or less authoritarian, that doesn't matter so much. Maybe just make sure your kid knows that whatever approach you take, that is done out of love, and whatever they do, you still love them. And your kid will be okay on that side of it. Don't abuse them. Don't forget to feed them. The typical basic, don't hit them with a wire. I don't know, things that should be pretty. I don't think I'm coming up with like really
common sense
advice here. And then the bullying side is really probably the thing parents maybe need to worry about. That's outside their control for the most part. It's just maybe keeping an eye on that and making sure that your kid's not being exposed to or engaging in, for that matter, too much of that behavior. I mean, every kid's going to be exposed to a little bit of bullying, unfortunately, but make sure that's not becoming an oppressive, unmanageable weight for them, which is really where you see that kids get problems with like depression, suicide, that kind of stuff. So those are really, I think, the big concerns, parents should have. And then of course, maybe a little bit of the drug stuff, as well. Make sure your kids are pretty, knowledgeable about staying away from, certainly the harder drugs, and maybe avoiding alcohol as much as possible.
The most important thing is make sure that the kids realize that the parents love them. And I think, and that's also kind of like probably like with the mass shooters, there's probably often had such families where they were not felt loved, or they were alone, so that they're just like the root of one of becoming mental ill. But now it's interesting. We see, madness is not only found in mass shooters, but often also in presidents. I said it to the beginning, in statesmen, heads of government, politicians, army commanders, or CEOs, and everything. And you actually have written a successful and exciting book. I actually started when I researched you, and now I started reading it. Cool. And it's titled "How Madness Shaped History." So tell us a little bit. What are the key messages of your book? No spoilers, so people will buy it. But what is the key message of that book?
Yeah. So it was actually motivated. Well, first off, I love history. So this was an excuse for me to write like a crossover history psychology book. But it was motivated in part because there are a lot of these other really good books out there that kind of talk about sort of like the rise and fall of civilizations, and they tend to focus in on like structural or environmental factors. So it's like, was it Guns, Germs, and Steel is a good example of that, where, they talk about like the reason like the Europeans became dominant in the 1600s is because of a combination of like, they had horses, right? And they managed to survive these like smallpox and this kind of stuff and build up immunities, right? And they had the wheel, and they had boats that could sail across, so kind of a combination of these structural technology factors, but also they were lucky enough to be where there was a lot of steel. They were immune to the right diseases because they've been exposed to them. And they had things like horses, that like the New World, well, New World in quotes, the Americas did not have horses, and then they never developed the wheel, right? And they didn't have big boats that could sail across, and they hadn't been exposed to smallpox. So what happens is, why do the Europeans sort of conquer the Americas? Because they have all these advantages, right? So theoretically, the Americas had lots of access to steel and horses and the wheel and big boats. They just could have came in the other direction, right? And so in other words, it was nothing unique about the cultures themselves. It really was just circumstance that led to like the rise or fall of one. And I think that's a lot persuasive about that. I don't think that's wrong, but it sort of left out this element of like the great person hypothesis, right? So there's also the great person hypothesis of history that basically says that like individuals do matter, right? So we can even look at recent history. You can look at, again, I keep picking on Ukraine, but like Zelensky, right? In the Ukraine, he had that choice early on. He could have left Kiev or stayed. And he stayed with that great quote of like, I need ammo, not a ride, right? And I don't want to be hagiographic about Zelensky. Maybe it'll turn out he like hates kittens or is a terrible person. I don't know. But at that moment in time, right, he was able to give the Ukraine, I know there's no the in Ukraine, give Ukraine I don't know why in America we put a the in front of it, but Ukraine, this big morale boost, right, that has allowed them to, it looks like, I mean, I think they're going to win. I don't know. Who knows? Like, here's going to go, right? But if he had fled, right, if he had taken out, that would have hurt Ukraine's morale. And so he really, at that moment, had a big influence, I think, over, what has happened. He's been a very successful leader, at least these last few months. Like I said, who knows? Maybe it'll turn out, that he eats puppies or something. I don't know. We'll all hate him again in the future. But, so you can see like individuals do matter, right? And you can look at the United States. I mean, obviously, I need to be upfront. I'm not a Trump fan. But, I think, if you got to look at like presidents who've done damage to the United States, I actually don't think that materially did a lot of damage to the United States. You look at like the George W. Bush administration, for instance. George Bush actually did much more damage with the Iraq War and other kinds of stuff than did Trump. Trump was just like a clown show. So he hurt our like reputation, even though he really didn't do anything, and even he took a lot of blame for COVID-19 because his messaging was not very effective, but far more Americans have died during the Biden administration than under. So we can see it in that case. Probably who was president wouldn't have mattered very much, honestly. But anyway, you can see from these examples, of course, the history, the individuals in history do matter. And being kind of a morbid, I already told you, I have a morbid sense of humor and all this sort of stuff, which has probably come out a few times. I probably don't dance around my jokes as well as I should, but I'm interested in like not so much like the Zelenskys of the world who have like whose virtue has helped their countries. I want to talk about the crazy jerks who screwed their countries. I have a more morbid sense. So I like these stories of like these psychopaths and maniacal, deranged rulers and who've done tons and tons of damage and hurt lots of people. Just because it goes back to the whole reason I got into psychology was over serial murderers and mass homicide perpetrators, right? So it's just sort of a version of that on steroids. So I think those stories are a lot of fun to talk about. But it also relates, so I do talk about Trump in there a little bit. I think if I were going to rewrite it, I probably would talk about Biden a little bit too. He hasn't been much better than Trump, honestly, but so I suspect he might have dementia. But anyway, so there, I think, if we kind of look at like how things are going, certainly in the United States, but I think also in other parts of the developed world as well, that we're all kind of losing our minds right now. And I think it kind of helps explore that and try to figure out why there's so much crazy going on, so if you look at like, again, living in the United States, my life is pretty similar to what it was 15 years ago. It's lovely here materially, but our politics are insane, right? So what happened? Why are our two political parties such rubbish? And they're rubbish in ways that they weren't rubbish 20 years ago. So what the hell happened? And they're both terrible. And it really, you can say the Republicans were first, and I think that's probably true. But over the last 10 years, both parties have lost their minds, so why? And is this a dangerous thing? I think so. And then also, if this is a problem, what can we do maybe to fix it? And I don't know. I mean, I have some ideas, but of course, that's going to be a long time, thing as well. But yeah, so I think it is fun to talk about these like Caligula and the third and all this kind of rulers who went insane one way or another. But also, I think it is important to talk about like our current madness.
Yeah.
And
but that's exactly the thing, like you said, you're both political parties, they're gone mad in some way, like and you said individuals matter. And here I often, like me, I have often the feeling when I look at the United States in the last, I don't know, since Ronald Reagan. I really like Ronald Reagan, I have to say. But since then, I have the feeling every time the candidates were kind of like, I always said to myself, does such a big country not find better candidates? And it's getting worse. Like I have feeling like I'm sorry, also Hillary Clinton also, I had the feeling she has also mental problems. I have to feel like she comes across. Trump, we talked about already, like he's very different, it's very special. And then we have Joe Biden, who I think is also like he's dementia probably, and he says stuff that I'm like, how can that be that the head of the state?
80. I mean, so what do you expect?
I mean, there's so many good people, and why don't you like? Is it also that the individuals destroyed the parties, and like that maybe some good people they don't even want to go and get involved anymore?
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously it's a complicated answer to it. So I agree with you that I think I like Reagan fine. I voted mostly for Democrats since then, and I was only a kid when Reagan was president. But since I kind of like think of like since Reagan. In my own head, I refer to this idea of like we're in the era of the bad presidents, right? And that maybe of them all, Obama was the least bad of the bad presidents, but all the other ones were rubbish in different ways. I mean, and a lot of it was structural. So you had like Bill Clinton, who's very charming, maybe a little too charming with the ladies, but he kind of started this idea that was embraced by both parties, in fairness, of this idea of like globalization, right? That putting all of our manufacturing in China, what could go wrong? Right? We'll have them make our masks, our semiconductor. I guess it's more Taiwan than China, but all these important things we'll have other people make, and we'll just buy it all. And as long as you have no conflict, that works out pretty good. But it turns out, right, in the middle of like a pandemic, it's not such a good plan anymore. It also screws the lower classes, the working classes, right? Who were those manufacturers, right? So. As being in the elite classes, and I guess you would include academics in that, right? It's nice to be able to buy cheap junk, that's made in China. But for the manufacturing classes, that screwed them over, right? So they're angry, that they should be able to have a living wage, making cars or surgical masks or whatever, or electronics or toys. Whatever else that were made in the United States or Switzerland or Germany or the UK or wherever else. Now they're all made in China and Mexico and places like that, right? So we can buy them cheaper, which is cool, but it screwed over a whole. So if you're wondering, like, why do those people vote for Trump? That's why, because they're pissed.
Absolutely,
they get screwed. And then you offer them someone like Hillary Clinton who insults them, right? So the basket of deplorables and all that kind of stuff. So it's not so much that these people are like looking for the return of like Nazism. They're not, they just feel like, they were mistreated by the sort of, we call it the coastal elites and what the equivalent in Switzerland might be. But, the people that live in Los Angeles and New York City, Seattle and Washington, D.C., and make, $250,000 a year sitting in an office on a laptop, and they control a lot of our news media and certainly academia, and things like that. So I would be in that probably, even though I'm certainly on the lower end of the income scale of that particular group of people, but and influence, for that matter. But and so that was a big mistake, I think, that we're all kind of starting to recognize, not that you couldn't have any globalization, but the sort of like full blown, would screw the working classes was a mistake, I think, but I think one of the tricks for the United States is we have this oh god, I'm blanking on the word for it, not the main elections, but the primaries. There we go. Your primary system, which really does not work to our advantage. Like for instance, every state's a little bit different, but in Florida, so I'm an independent. I'm not technically a member of either party. So I can't vote in the primaries for either party.
Because you're an independent.
Yeah, because I'm independent, right? I don't really believe in either party. I don't want to be affiliated with either party, but on the other hand, that means if we have like a Republican presidential primary, and let's say the people on order are someone like Trump, who's sane, or Nikki Haley, who's quite rational, I think would be a very effective president. I would vote for her if they nominated Nikki Haley. Above a Democrat, probably. I have never voted for a Republican for president yet, but I would vote for her. What we have is two things. One, all the independents can't vote in that, which means that only the more diehard Republican who love Trump, are going to vote, in that. And two, the proportion of people who vote in primaries is so small. Most of us have jobs and families and hobbies and stuff that getting off our asses on a Tuesday, to vote in the primaries. We'll do it for the big elections because it feels more important, but for the primaries, it doesn't feel as important. So you only get the most dedicated people who go to the primaries, and those people are insane. That's why they're obsessed. That's why they go. They're like living emotionally in politics. So you get the wackiest people who vote in the primaries, which means that you end up with candidates who have to kind of cater to that.
I see.
Extreme. And the same thing, I'm picking on the Republicans, the same thing on the Democrat side, they do the same thing. You get like AOC, who is just like Trump on the left. She would be just as much a disaster as a president. But we do have a few people that are good, but you have two situations. You have like I'm gonna pick on the Republicans again. The Democrats have like nobody interesting in the it's Joe right now. It's Biden or nobody. Other than that guy Eric Adams, who's the mayor of New York City now. He looks really good. I'm hoping that he might get some pull. Very centrist Democrat. So he seems promising. Again, if it came, I would love to see him versus Nikki Haley. That would be my lineup. I think what we're going to get is Joe Biden versus Trump.
Probably.
Looks but like the problem is you either have someone like Nikki Haley who tries to stay fairly centrist. She may occasionally throw a piece of red meat towards towards her wing nuts or whatever, but tries to stay more like a normal human being. But then she won't get traction because she's more reserved in her vocalizations, other than like Trump, who's like all over the place, kind of stuff, So you'll have that, or you may have someone like DeSantis. So he's our governor in Florida, very popular in Florida, and he's up for a re-election. He's I would absolutely bet a steak dinner that he's going to get the reelected in Florida. People, even the Democrats, kind of like him. To a surprising proportion of Democrats like him, at least. Not everybody likes him, obviously. But his policy, he actually, there again, it's kind of his approach seems to be to kind of mostly run things normally. So Florida's running fine. Other than he likes to then create these controversies over culture war sorts of things. So he kind of like runs like a normal bureaucrat, which is good, which makes him different from Trump, who was just like a bull in a china shop. So he's running things like a normal Republican, but he's cynical enough to like do these things like like the whole controversy over Disney and whether you talk about so, and some of that stuff, this is where I say things are insane. So if you like kind of look at that issue where he's basically saying he's trying to limit what can be said in terms of like sexuality or gender in schools. And here's exactly what I'm talking about, where both sides are just making each other nuttier and nuttier, right? So some of that makes sense. Like there probably is a core real problem with some schools, anecdotally at least. May not be most schools, but anecdotally, some schools have screwed up, no question about it, and have done things that probably are not wise pedagogically. So could you handle that in the legislature? Sure, you could. But then, of course, what happens is the Republicans will release a piece of legislation that's vague enough that not only is it banning stuff like, showing elementary school kids an explicit video or something like that, right? Which nobody thinks that you should do that, So it's not very clear in the language. So now you have teachers who are gay who are like, well, can I talk about going kayaking with my husband this weekend? The law actually doesn't say you can't. Yeah. It doesn't say you can either. So it's not really clear. So the law doesn't really say you can't say gay. You can say gay, but or at least it doesn't explicitly ban you from saying it. This doesn't make it always quite clear what you can say. But then what will happen? So the right now have escalated the situation, right? So then the left will then escalate and say, well, in our schools, we're going to show kids this book where they have an explicit scene of one person giving another person a blowjob in it, right? Which like 90% of people think even in high school is not appropriate, And then the right, so now like the right is like less crazy than the left, and then the right will start with this whole like, well, you guys are all pedophiles, you're all yes. Sort of stuff. Like, oh my God. And it's just like each side is just escalating crazier and crazier in their decisions. And so all of these things, like, talking about like critical race theory in school, talk about gender and sexuality in school, are just both sides being stupider and like in a race to like idiocy, and the problems are real. I mean, a lot of the stuff probably if you ask 90% of parents, they'll say, yeah, we ought to talk about like racism, slavery, and Jim Crow, and try to get people not to judge each other based on race. We should talk about that, but we shouldn't say the modern United States is like awash with systemic racism or stuff like that, which is not true. We're not the same as like 1955 United States or the Indian caste system or something like that, or Nazi Germany or whatever like that. And you just can't. They're just like. Yeah, if you could take like 10 sane people who are 5 of them Republican, 5 of them Democrat, put them together in a room, I'm sure you could work out most of these issues, and they just don't. That's American politics right now, right? It's just no incentive for people to get together and say, okay, like, everybody, let's walk this back a little bit. We've gotten off. We've gone down a garden path with this. Let's walk it back. What does the data say? We ought to talk to kids with at any given age level about sex, for instance, what actually helps them as opposed to makes me feel good as an adult, or screws over the other side, or just trolling the Republicans or trolling the libs at this point. What does the data say is helpful in terms of talking about race, or ethnicity, in terms of bringing people together, and making everybody more egalitarian, as opposed to simply pissing everybody off or thinking that you can't succeed in the United States because you're black, or that if you're white, you are guilty of white fragility or something like that. On the other hand, that's the same thing. People, the left has put some stuff into schools that obviously is harmful, obviously is bad, and then they'll deny it. They say, we don't teach CRT in school. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You don't Delgado or Kimberly Crenshaw, but certainly some of the pedagogy in some schools is influenced by CRT. Let's just stop with that altogether. But on the other hand, then you have like Texas banning Martin Luther King. Come on, people, you're both insane. This is. So that's American politics right now, right? It's the most embarrassing thing about the United States. I will tell you, like, we're not that bad in terms of crime. You're not going to get killed. Actually, you're pretty free. Don't worry about us. We're not like oppressed or anything. But American politics is absurd, absolutely absurd. We've gone crazy with our politics, and that is humiliating.
But so you basically have to be a little bit psychopath to go into politics.
Absolutely.
And I mean, but isn't that also a little bit like, I mean, I read that also, like many successful CEOs are pronounced narcissists, and so you have to have in some way a certain psychopathic side to be successful. But now probably it's almost in the US, not only in the US, I can tell you there's a lot of weird politicians, very narcissistic also in Europe. But now it's almost going too far, I think. You need a certain narcissistic side to be successful, but now it's going too far. And another question I want to ask you is like, what you said, like you really like this, like Morbid and Caligula, and so which one is the most for you? The most your favorite, crazy, mad, like a head of state or conqueror? Or whatever.
there are a lot of great ones. So it's like asking me which of my children is my favorite. I've only got one child, so it's an easy question for me. But no, I mean, I think probably my favorite person to talk about is actually Elizabeth Bathory, because she was a female serial killer from the late 1500s, and really grotesque, disturbing story, because she was a sexual sadist. And stuff. And, the estimates were that she killed somewhere between 350 and 600 young women over the course of maybe 20 or 30 years. So she's a fascinating story, but, she wasn't, she was a noble woman, but she wasn't terribly involved in like national politics or stuff like that. But, politicians, of course, like Caligula is fascinating. He had a 4-year reign as a Roman emperor, just like was a disaster. He had one good year. And then it looks like he probably got some kind of brain infection, like an encephalitic or meningitis type infection, and left him in rough shape. And he just went nuts, and almost tore the Roman Empire apart in the last 3 years of his reign before he's finally assassinated. So he's, in terms of like just sheer crazy over a short span of time, he's pretty fascinating. Of course, you get to your usual favorites like Hitler and Stalin and Mao and that kind of stuff, who went through tens of millions of people of their own. Well, I guess Hitler was maybe a little bit less than that, but certainly Stalin and Mao killed off tens of millions of their own citizens, not just other people's citizens, but their own citizens. So those are always kind of fascinating stories. But there are a lot of really good ones. Even some of the ones that are like George III of England. He wasn't a bad guy, but he had it looks like he probably had porphyria, which is a hormonal imbalance that made him nuts, essentially. So the good news there was England had already become a mostly constitutional parliamentary system by the time he was king. And the kings had a little bit more influence then than they do now. Well, it's a good thing they don't have any influence now. But yeah, he just ended up on Pluto, basically, and just a fascinating story about even then the parliamentary system, how kind of paralyzed the UK became, because the king at that point still had to sign off on stuff, and he couldn't use the bathroom like a normal person could, because he deteriorated so badly when he would have these episodes of porphyria that he was chasing women around the the castle and stuff that weren't his wife, and I don't know, just gibbering, all kinds of other stuff, so even some of those the stories are kind of fun, I guess, in a way. He didn't completely ruin the UK, obviously, but and it's interesting too, because he wasn't a bad guy. When he was sane, he was pretty decent. But when he went mad, when he had these episodes of porphyria, then he just lost his marbles, entirely. So those are a lot. There's a lot of fun, stories.
What do you say about of Vladimir Putin?
Yeah,
well, you could add him in the book, right?
No? Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a grand. He has, even for narcissists, he's pretty high on that, because he has this idea apparently of restoring the Russian Empire and all this kind of stuff, of which he thinks Ukraine, is part, but also probably Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia and all these kind of Baltic states. And so, certainly some of those in Poland, so some of those states are. There's a reason why they're nervous, because they were part of the Russian Empire at one point, or parts of them were part of the Russian Empire, or the Soviet Union, one or the other. So yeah, I think having that grandiose sense of restoring empire is a scary thing. It never turns out well, for the most part. And I think the element to add to that, I mean, he's also quite paranoid. I mean, he's also created this sort of system around himself where clearly he's not being given good advice, which is also kind of a scary thing for any world leader, if they're not surrounding themselves with people that will tell them no, that, or like, this is a bad plan. Like, if you're gonna be a world leader, you need somebody next to you who's gonna say, like, I'm not sure this is so smart, right? And clearly he doesn't have that going on. He, the Russians clearly blew it in Ukraine, but I think the psychopathic element is really the most interesting one, because there's this question, and some other conversations I've had has come up of like, what would happen if, say, NATO went full in with Ukraine, and Joe Biden, who has his own issues, I think, sort of mouthed off about regime change. We need to get rid of it, right? Whatever. And what would happen if NATO actually invaded Russia, say, which I'm sure they could do at this point. The Russians have so like tumbling over themselves that a NATO invasion of Russia probably would be fairly successful. I shouldn't say easy. I think there'd be a lot of casualties, absolutely. But let's say hypothetically that NATO decided to do that and backed Putin into the Kremlin. So it looks like just like we did in Iraq, but just on a bigger level, of course. Russia's a much bigger country. But let's say we were going to do regime change in Russia like we did in Iraq, for instance. What would Putin do, given that he has access to nuclear weapons? So the question that's interesting is, would Putin essentially be willing to cause the end of humanity if that, would his own loss of power be enough to propel him into pushing the button on these nuclear weapons? My guess is yes. I think he would. I don't think he cares much about anybody other than Putin. So this idea of like nuclear winter and the mass extinctions and stuff like that, I don't think that's on his radar at all. And that kind of makes me nervous a little bit. About obviously hope Ukraine prevails in the struggle, but this idea that we should escalate and have like a no-fly zone, or that American troops should enter Ukraine or stuff like that, I think that makes me a little bit wary. Supplying them with weapons seems to be working out pretty well. Like I said, I hope the Ukraine prevails in Ukraine. But in terms of like regime change, I think we just need to let Putin get old and die like everybody else. Although I think he's only in his 60s, so he's still pretty young.
I don't know. I think he's like more going to the 70s, I think. And he looks like he's sick also. Like he's very bloated always. So I don't know. Maybe
at one point, I guess it never came. I thought at one point they talked about him having some sort of neurological disease.
Yeah, but it never came out what it is, if it's cancer or neurological or. Yeah. But but if you said so, like he's a narcissist on a high level, and he seems to have psychopathic elements. So. Yeah, it's really difficult. I think we cannot rationalize with such people, and I think often we try to figure out what do they do, like what's the next step and everything, but that's very difficult. So, like still, like if now Joe Biden would come to you and say like, "Hey, you have a clue about people with mental issues. How should I deal with this guy?" What would you tell him?
So I say, assuming you remember this conversation in 30 seconds. No, I mean, I think the safest exit is to figure out some sort of way. So first off, I would stop yakking about regime change, but I think the safest way out of this is probably to find some kind of, people use the term like off ramp or face saving, something where Putin can exit Ukraine and get something. Whether that's the removal of the sanctions, or some other, kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis, we removed some missiles from Eastern Europe or something. I don't know, something that, this kind, maybe it's a token, maybe it's not really going to be something super substantial, but something that he can say like, look, I invested all this in and here's what I got, from it. I don't think you can give him any Ukrainian territory. I don't think that's fair to the Ukrainians, and I don't think that would discourage him. So it needs to be enough that he's discouraged from trying this sort of thing again. But on the same point, he's given some sort of exit, where he can claim some sort of face-saving thing. So we say like, we'll remove, maybe if we've been sending them Patriot missile batteries to Poland, we'll say we'll take out the Patriot missile batteries from Poland, something like that. And then 5 years later, we put them back in, but at least at the moment, he's given this chance to sort of save face and but that's tricky. I mean, I just use that as one example. I mean, as I say this, and if you have any Polish listeners, they're probably pissed off. Oh my God, no.
Of course.
No, I get it. I'm not saying that has to be the thing. So obviously you need to take some time to figure out what kind of. Like,
you have to give him something. That
it should be token. It shouldn't really because Poland will legitimately say, well, that's going to make us weaker. Now, and that just came out the top of my head. So it be something that's not really going to make like Poland weaker or that kind of stuff, but that you can say like,
something that makes him look good.
We'll cancel, multinational exercises in Eastern Europe this year.
Something like this.
Kind of a thing, might be a reasonable kind of token gesture. So he can say, haha, NATO's scared, they're pulling back, whatever. He can do that on his national TV, where we really didn't give him much of anything at all. And then, hopefully that restores Ukrainian sovereignty at that point. But it also comes a question of like, how long do you want the war to go? Because if Ukraine is doing well, if they can restore their eastern frontier and theoretically even get the Crimea back, that would be awesome for the Ukrainians. So, but on the other hand, that would be humiliating loss for Putin. So,
and that doesn't go with a narcissist. I think you should.
No, that'd be a harder sell. I mean, I think they might be able to, take back their eastern territories because that was never formally ceded to, none of this was formally ceded to Russia, but I don't think Russia formally annexed those territories, either the Donbass and stuff, but they did annex Crimea. But anyways, getting into the political science, but basically, you need to give them something to off ramp, without screwing the Ukrainians and without screwing the Poles or the Baltic states or the other countries that are on the border of Russia that are nervous. Because a lot of these parts are part of the Russian Empire, if you will, including Poland and the Baltic states. So they have a good reason to be scared. So, and Finland. So the reason why Finland wants
to go join NATO, and Sweden.
They've been attacked by Russia before. So
exactly, they have. That's also they actually have also. That's why they also have quite a lot of guns in Finland. They also have a.
I've heard that Finland's military. So to pick on Europe a little bit, Finland apparently is one of the few European countries to actually live up to their the 2% of GDP that they're supposed to contribute, even though they're not in NATO.
They're not in NATO, but they know why. They know why, and that's.
I blame it on the Germans. The Germans are just kind of hanging out, nude sunbathing in summer near their lakes, going like, "Oh, these Americans! Why don't they have healthcare the way we do?"
Exactly, but now they're
your national military. That's
exactly.
Being invaded by Russia.
Exactly. Yes. So I think we made the whole tour.
Okay, cool.
But I one thing last thing I would like to mention is you also write novels.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just say quick something about your novels, but maybe somebody wants to buy one. I just saw that online that you have. And what kind of novels are you writing?
I write in a variety of genres. The one that I have out right now is a mystery novel that is set in Renaissance Florence. It's called Suicide Kings, and it's available, any kind of Amazon, Barnes and Noble, whatever's available in Europe. It's equivalent to that. It should be pretty easy to get a hold of. But I also write in other areas like science fiction and horror and fantasy and that kind of stuff. So I've gotten another one I think that's going to be coming out in the next year called Fury. That's going to be set in the Dark Ages Greece. So sort of between the classical and oh god, I'm gonna forget the name. So pre-classical Greek anyway. Between the age of the and there's a word for it, and I'm not Macedonian, but I'm gonna think of it exact. As soon as we get off, I'll remember it. It starts with M. I know that, but there are two eras in Greece. It's kind of like the era of like the Achilles and the Trojan War, and then there's like a dark period where nobody knows what happens, and then there's a classical like Athens and Sparta, that kind of stuff. So it takes place in that in between period. So anyway, and of course as you can tell, name remembrance is a thing for me. So that's something I got some of these. I have a little bit of aphasia, I think. So, but anyway, so hopefully that'll come out another year too. So they're a lot of fun to write.
Cool. So people should check it out. They shall check out Christopher J Ferguson. There's the psychologist. I think there's also an astronaut I saw, from NASA.
Much more famous Christopher.
There's three famous ones. There's you. There's the astronaut and a poker player, I think. Yes. So people should check you out. They should go on Amazon also. They find your novels, but also that book that I really highly recommend. Also, that we mentioned, How Madness Shaped History. It's also I think it's very entertaining to read. The book, and you can learn a lot. So, and maybe when you have another book out next year or so, I can make another one, and we can talk about your book.
That'd be awesome. Sounds good.
Yes. So, hey, thank you. Thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun, and I think, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Awesome. Me
talking
too.
with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on today. I've had a lot of fun. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you were able to learn something, or at least the show made you think a little bit. If you liked the show, and if you would like to reread the transcript of this interview, go to my website www.muellermatthias.ch. That is MUELLERMATHIAS.ch. There you find the transcript, and you find also the German translation of our talk. So that's it. I hope you tune in again in a week when there's a new episode of the podcast The Stoic Pirate. That's it. Have a great week. Peace, and see you soon, or hear you soon. Bye-bye.